morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Environmental Social Justice. I'm your host, Wendy Nystrom, and today we have returning guest Brian Moskal. He is an environmental attorney with Greensburg and Glusker. Welcome back, Brian.
Thanks for having me back.
Anytime. So when you and I were talking last time, we talked about contamination and remediation and wastewater issues and all the dirt out there, and we started to stumble across our personal stories about why you need phase ones. So could you really quick explain to people what a phase one or an environmental site assessment is?
Sure. So when someone or a company is acquiring property, generally commercial or industrial property, maybe multifamily like an apartment building or a condo building, one of the important things to do is conduct some environmental due diligence to make sure that you're not buying sort of a money trap from an environmental perspective. And so the phase one, as the name implies, is the first step in doing that, and it entails hiring an environmental consultant who goes out and does a site visit at the property to look for issues that suggest there might be an environmental problem, and then also pulls all sorts of historical records from local agencies, state and federal agencies, aerial photographs, phone books, remember those, to see who was operating at the property, fire insurance maps, things like that, with the ultimate goal of trying to figure out if there's a reasonable possibility of an environmental problem at the property before you buy it and become strictly liable for it.
Because once you buy that property, you are responsible for everything on it and under it.
That's right.
So you want to make sure that there are no surprises. So when Brian was talking about these phase ones, before my illustrious career in insurance, I was the person out in the field. And this was before the internet was the internet. So I was hauling my butt to City Hall, to the local library, to local EPA offices, collecting paper. And when you really quickly mentioned fire insurance maps, people are probably thinking, why do that? Sanborn was the company. Sanborn Fire Insurance Maps did these beautifully detailed drawings of sites going back to the 1800s in some places. And they would have little circles for drums and little squares for underground storage tanks. Or if it was a railroad turnstile that are super dirty, it would have a little roundabout. Those are very important to know about because 100 years later, there may not be any evidence that you can see, but it's definitely in the ground.
Right. They don't make maps like that anymore.
They do not. And even the old aerial photographs, I would go through these ones from like 1920, and I'd see, oh, look at all these underground storage tanks being installed that they just happened to fly over that day. But there's no evidence online or at the local fire department of them being installed because back then, people just did it.
Right.
You didn't file a permit. You just did it. You just threw it in your backyard and you never thought about it again.
Right.
So that's why it's so important. And I'll go into my story time. But Brian, why don't you talk about your story time of maybe some horror things that you've seen as an attorney?
Well, one of the worst is a client who didn't conduct a phase one at all. I'm sure you and I will talk a little bit about phase ones that aren't very good or that miss things. But this is a story about a client who didn't conduct a phase one at all. So this was a piece of commercial property in the valley here in Los Angeles. And the property was in bankruptcy. And so the client thought, oh, what a deal. I'm going to get this commercial. And they were a property owner. They were sort of building this portfolio. And they thought, I'm going to get this great deal on this commercial property out of bankruptcy. And they got it for a song. They did no environmental due diligence whatsoever, not even a Google search. I don't recommend that for phase one, but they didn't even do a Google search because if they had, they would have realized that there had been 3 different companies at this property that had manufactured printed circuit boards from about the 1950s through the 1990s. And folks may not know, but the manufacture of printed circuit boards involves some hazardous substances like TCE, PCE, chlorinated solvents. They cause some problems, some environmental issues. Not only that, the second of the 3 circuit board manufacturing companies had a proprietor who actually went to jail for environmental criminal liability for about 2 or 3 months. Not, he didn't serve a lot of hard time.
Slap on the wrist.
Yeah, slap on the wrist. But he went to jail for committing environmental crimes in connection with unlawful disposal of waste at this property, which is why if the client, God bless them, had done a Google search, that would have turned up because it wasn't that long ago. And but they did nothing. And so they found themselves in the position of having the regional water board, investigating the property back in the 80s and 90s, as the agencies often do. They kind of fell asleep at the wheel. Nobody was really paying attention. They found some gnarly stuff in the ground, but didn't really do anything about it and waited about 20 years. somehow woke back up, said, what's going on at this property? Lo and behold, all 3 prior operators had gone out of business, nowhere to be found. The man who had gone to jail was deceased. And our client, who now owned the property, was the only entity left standing. So despite having absolutely nothing at all to do with the disposal of the hazardous waste, the operations that caused the disposal of the hazardous waste, he's now on the hook for somewhere between maybe $5 and $7 million to remediate soil and groundwater at the property.
This is not cheap, folks. This is why you do your homework, you do your diligence. So my turn for story time. When I was an environmental consultant, fresh out of college, knew nothing. I was in Massachusetts, and I was sent out to do some water sampling. So groundwater, there's a little cap in the ground. It just says water on it. There's usually a groundwater monitoring well in there. It's just a well with a sieve through it, so water can go in. Then you have this long plastic tube. You drop the tube down. There's a little marble at the bottom that plugs up the hole at the bottom. So when you pull it up, you pull water up. So I drop the baler in. I pull it out, and there's about that much of dark black oil. And we call that light non-aqueous phase liquid, or LNAPL, because it was floating. DNAPL is dense, it would sink. So it's floating, and it's dark black, and I'm like, wow, didn't expect to see that. Went back to the office, and it turns out that that convenience store used to be a gas station 30, 40 years ago. They never removed the tanks. They just closed it, paved it over, convenience store on top. Move on. Now, what I hadn't realized, because again, I was brand new to the field, is my manager said, so you noticed you were on a hill? And I said, well, yeah, it's New England, it's very hilly. And he said, all of the homes that are down gradient have basements. Yeah, it's New England, everyone has a basement. We now have to do a vapor survey of all those homes, because that oil will be seeping through the concrete as a vapor and potentially be explosive, if not make people sick. So that was fun, because now you got a site where you hadn't expected to find anything. And now, fortunately I'd moved on to a different project, so I didn't have to do it. But some poor guy had to go knock on doors and like, hey, can I test the fumes in your basement to make sure it's healthy? Not the situation you want to be in.
No.
Because that's going to be litigious. And that's where Brian comes in.
That's right. That's right. We do not enjoy having to knock on the doors of residential neighbors. That's for sure.
It is not fun. And talking about the dense or DNAPL, Brian, when you talked about chlorinated solvents, that sinks like a stone. Chlorinated solvents is very, very hard to get out. Like when it floats, you usually pump a treat, suck it out, vaporize. But when it's really getting into those crevices of soil and bedrock, it's a pain to get out, and it's expensive. And I don't think people realize, like when you have a dry cleaner, you have some kind of cleaning agent involved, a degreasing agent involved, you're going to have that. And it's going to be a real pain to get out. So just do your homework and get an environmental consultant out there. And I've been out of the insurance world for a while, but site pollution took a dive. Like not many people are writing site pollution insurance policies anymore. I just don't see. Do you guys see those at all? I see a couple.
Yeah. Beasley will still write them. Catlin XL. There are still a few carriers out there who will write them, and so.
Okay, that's good.
But that's a good point, because if you want environmental insurance in connection with the acquisition of a property, the insurer is absolutely going to want a phase 1. And if there's any indication in the phase 1 of a recognized environmental condition, or REC, which is the term of art that means you might have a problem here, maybe yes, maybe no, the insurer will absolutely require you to do phase 2 testing to follow that up and see if there is actually a problem. And if there's a problem, of course, it'll be excluded from coverage.
Yeah, they usually write that out. So when we're talking about phase 1s and phase 2, phase 1 is, where you take the walk on the property. You go to the fire department, you look at their permits, you go to the library, you pull the Sanborn fire insurance maps, the aerial photographs, you do your historical research. If you see evidence of something, meaning on your walk you saw some oil spills, you find a little creek nearby that has some swirls of rainbows in it. One way you poke it with a stick, if those swirls of rainbow swirl around, that's oil. If it breaks apart like a stained glass window, it's usually bacteria. So when you have those different kinds, you taught you something. I saw your.
Did not know that.
So when you have these little environments, like, hey, we think you have an issue, you got to do the phase 2 where you pop holes in the ground. By popping holes in the ground, all that means is you're doing soil borings and you're doing groundwater testing. And that's when you send it to the lab and find out what's in it. 99% of the time, you're going to hit something. There are very few pure areas left on this planet that haven't been impacted by something somewhere at some time. We have something called background conditions. So most people know cities are pretty contaminated. You're not going to have pure virgin soil. So as long as you are below reportable conditions or background conditions, you're usually okay. Brian, I know you probably know that a little bit more precisely than I do, especially with the state of California. I did all my work in Massachusetts. Boston is very old and very contaminated.
Yeah, no, it's true out here. One thing people don't realize in Los Angeles is that we have a very long and storied history of manufacturing, and in particular of aerospace manufacturing. So people think of LA, they think of maybe the entertainment industry, not a lot of environmental problems there, at least in the subsurface, only culturally. But no, I'm kidding. But there is a long history of manufacturing, and particularly when you go out toward the ocean, you had companies like Hughes Aircraft that were doing aerospace and using lots and lots of chlorinated solvents. To say nothing of, like you mentioned, the mom and pop gas station, or one of my favorites is shopping centers. People are like, oh, I'm buying a shopping center, great investment. What they don't realize is a lot of shopping centers historically had dry cleaners, and dry cleaners use PCE. And according to some experts, more than 50% of historical dry cleaners that use PCE have had releases to the environment. So,
oh yeah, PCE being chlorinated solvent. That's a degreaser.
Right.
No, back then, I like to think better of people, that they just didn't do this thinking, oh, to hell with it, I'm just going to contaminate it. They didn't know. It was the solution to pollution was dilution. And you just hosed it down, you dropped it down a drain, you didn't really think much about it, not realizing the consequences. And
I can't tell you how many times I've talked to sort of the old timers, particularly in litigation. And, sometimes in insurance litigation, for example, the insurer will want to say, well, you had to have known this would cause a problem. And if you knew that it would cause a problem, you don't have coverage. And we go talk to the old timers, and they're putting waste in unlined pits and ponds in the ground. And they genuinely had, until about maybe the mid to late 1970s, 1980s, depending, they had no idea that it would cause any problems. They really, truly didn't. And oftentimes you would have the government come out and inspect these operations and say, well, everything looks good here.
Yeah, looks great. Good job.
It's like smoking, people just didn't know.
Smoking was, at time, they told you it was good for your health. Recommended 4 out of 5 doctors. There were actually ads that had, a doctor being like, we recommend this brand.
Right.
And it strengthens your lungs. No, it did not.
Right. Well, even with chlorinated solvents, in one of my cases, we found an advertisement from, I want to say 40s, 50s, somewhere in that era, that recommended TCE, another chlorinated solvent, TCE masks to calm pregnant women. And we now know that TCE can cause fetal heart malformations in the first trimester of pregnancy. So it's just, but it also, if you talk to people who were exposed to it, it can make you sleepy. So we had a guy who crashed a car on his way home from degreasing some circuit boards because he got sleepy. So you can see how these masks would have calmed a pregnant mother, or pregnant woman, but it was not healthy.
Poisoning their child simultaneously.
Right.
Not good things. These are not good things. And when you brought up, you had to have known. There are people that know fully well what they are doing when they are breaking the law. I had a site assessment that I walked the site and we saw the rings of old 55-gallon drums, but they were all gone. He's like, oh no, I've disposed of those. And I'm like, okay, cool. Walking around, seeing an above ground storage tank, or an AST. And I'm like, oh, does that ever leak? Do you ever see leakage? He's like, nope, never leaks. But when it rains, it floods. I'm like, well, dude, if liquid's going in, liquid's coming out. But okay. But I didn't see any real evidence of anything bad. So we're like, okay, it's a very old site. Again, it's New England. It's an old warehouse. 3 weeks later, the EPA raids this guy because someone dropped a dime on him. He stuffed all of that stuff up the chimney. So I didn't know this, again, I was new in the field. All I needed was a flashlight to look up the chimney, and I would have seen just drums all the way up. And wow. And he went to jail. I don't know, or rather prison. I do not know how long he was in prison for, but he knew what he was doing. He lied. He said he properly disposed of it. He took money from people saying he would properly dispose of it, pocketed that money, and just hid it. So That is a classic case of doing bad things.
Right. Well, and sometimes at particularly undeveloped properties and properties that don't have a lot of security in place in terms of fencing or
Oh yeah.
security guards, you'll have midnight dumping, which is just people finding a good spot down down the highway to dump their drums of whatever, and so that can be an issue.
Oh yeah, I knew someone. Whoa, we're going back 25 years. I will not disclose it. Any statutes run out by now anyway. But they found out that the shingles on their home were asbestos. And rather than properly disposing of it, had like 50 individual garbage bags and just went around Manhattan, New York, and dumped them off in random garbage bins.
Oh, wow.
And I'm like, you did what now? And he said, yeah, he said, I know it's wrong now. He said, at the time, I didn't think it was that big of a deal. I'm like, these are things I don't want to know, that I don't really need to be told.
Right.
I don't hang out with that dude, but in fact, I don't even remember the guy's name, to be honest. This was going back a long time. But when you hear stories like that, like, dude, don't tell people that, if you did something that terribly wrong, maybe don't mention it during a cocktail party. You don't know who's going to be in the room with you.
Yeah.
And being the person buying the land, that, when we talked about people doing bad things, do that due diligence. Perfect example, there was a very large corporation. This is when I was underwriting. So now I'd moved into the insurance side. And I was told, this is a friend's account, just write it. And I'm like, okay, met with the chief risk officer and said, I need to see your phase 1 reports. And they said, oh, we don't have any. And I said, no, yeah, when you buy the property, the bank's going to require it for mortgages and stuff. And they said, no, we bought all cash. There's no report. I'm like, I can't write this. And I actually got in trouble with my boss because it was his buddy. And I'm like, I cannot put the company on the line for tens of millions of dollars because it's a friend of yours.
Right.
And I was deemed difficult. And I'd actually changed jobs by then. I went to a new company. Within 1 month of my departure, that company was fined by the EPA for $10 million for contaminated property. And I'm like, uh-huh. Yeah.
Did the policy ever get written?
No, I would not write it, and no one else would. And they tried to, because I was kind of I think I at the time was probably the most junior on the staff, and they were trying to force me, bully me into doing it. And I held my ground. I'm like, I'm not going to put my name on this. And it turns out, like 1 or 2 months after my leaving, EPA came down hard. Or not EPA, it's the local DEP for New Jersey. And I was just like, see, I mean, sometimes you just get that spidey sense where something's wrong, and you got to do that research because there's something there.
Right. Did you send an email to that broker?
No. I just
you're a better person.
I try to be, but in their eyes, I'm difficult and I don't do deals. And like, I protected the company that I worked for from losing $10 million.
Right.
That was my take on that one. But there's so many like that. So many of these sites that people, as you said, they don't do any of that due diligence. And when you talked about the guy who bought the property for a sweet deal, I had someone come to me with an account they wanted me to write. And they said, listen, it was an old military site. They were getting rid of it. It has like a school, a stadium, an auditorium. It has like their barracks. It's awesome. We got it for a really cheap price. And I said, okay, red flags are flying because this is military.
Right.
The military is exempt from EPA law. And I said, do you have your phase 1, phase 2 environmental site assessment? No, we don't have any of that. And I'm like, okay, you might want to do some research on your property.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I never heard back from them because I think they realized that they were in a bit of a pickle. So yeah, it's amazing how that story was only going back probably 10 years. But people, they don't think about it. And as you said, with somebody who knows what they're doing, it's so important to get an environmental consulting firm that knows what they're doing. And best is if they're local because they know their region.
Right. And it will only cost, a phase 1, depending on the size of the property, the number of parcels that comprise the property, you can get a phase 1 for $3,000 to $6,000. You can hire an environmental lawyer to review it for $1,000 or $2,000 and save literally millions of dollars.
Yeah, these cleanups. What's the most expensive cleanup that you've seen so far?
Well, I've worked on some super fun sites that are pushing $1 billion, but in terms of sort of individual parcels of land, probably upwards of about 10 million.
10 million. The
Yeah.
average when I was writing site we call them pollution legal liabilities or site pollution coverage. The average cleanup at that point was like probably just under $1 million. So as you know, obviously things are getting worse. And with the new PFAS rules that came out, I think we're going to start seeing sites get reopened that were once closed.
Yes.
So that's going to be another thing to consider is, do you have PFAS contamination, which we all do.
Right. It's very
every...
And now that EPA, the US EPA, has designated PFAS compounds, certain of them, as hazardous substances, they now have to be evaluated under phase ones.
That is, I see. And phase ones, I mean, when I first started, they didn't even have regulated phase ones yet. They were still environmental site assessments, and everyone was a little bit different. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't regulated till probably a couple years in the field. And then people started calling them phase ones. And I said, so which is it, an EPA, ESA, or phase one? They're like, it's both. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, it's interesting sometimes to review some of the older reports from before the regulations were amended to adopt the ASTM standard, and they'll be like 7 or 8 pages. It's so funny because now, most phase one reports, they're 30, 40 pages, literally thousands of pages of appendices often. And some of these older reports, 7, 8 pages, everything's fine.
That's what I wrote.
Walk down memory lane.
Oh, well, the best was, again, this was my first job out of college. I mean, I knew nothing from nothing. And the EPA had just done their new regulations for underground storage tanks. So you either had to pull your tank or put a cathode on it to make sure for leak detection. So I was probably averaging between 30 and 40 phase ones a week.
Wow.
And
wow.
It was awful. It was awful because it was just a stack. And you were out in the field. I can't tell you how many times I fell asleep in my car driving home because you're just sampling and walking and doing. Again, this was before things were online. So you had to go to the fire department. You had to go to the library. You had to go to the local DEP office. You had to run around to all these physical places. Xerox things. And then put them in, and if you had to do soil sampling and to, get things to the lab and back and forth. It was tedious. It really was. And we only charged, I think, $1,500 a report.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, it was definitely quantity, maybe not so much quality back then, but there was a deadline. If you didn't make that deadline, you got your underground storage tanks locked out, meaning they put a wire through it, pressed it with something that said, US EPA on it, and you could not fill your tanks with gasoline if you did not have that done.
Wow.
And at that point, I'd switched over to working for the state of Massachusetts. And I knew the guy that had to do the lockouts. And he said some days were a little rough.
I would imagine.
Because, people would threaten him, and he'd have to sometimes come with a sheriff with him or some kind of police officer. Because he's like, you don't have this is a federal law. You don't have it done. I got to lock you out. And it would get dicey. It would be uncomfortable for him.
I would not want that job.
Mm-mm. And he had a great personality. He was actually a lot of fun, very jovial. I think his sense of humor is what saved him from some of the stuff he had to deal with on a regular basis. But when I'm this isn't just story time, guys. This is telling the reality of what these guys deal with daily. And what Brian does as the environmental attorney, you deal with basically the litigation aspect of it and helping people either recover from it or get their insurance coverage. You're a busy guy. You're going to be very busy with PFAS.
Yeah.
I know that.
Yeah. Ever since I started working in this field almost 20 years ago, we've heard, environmental litigation is dying down. Oh, we dealt with all the petroleum sites. Okay. Now we dealt with all the chlorinated solvent sites. Okay. Now there were some jet fuel sites and we've dealt with all of those, but we're done now. And there's always an emerging contaminant.
The first time I heard of PFAS, probably 15 years ago, there's a new insurtech company coming on. I was talking to them, and they said, "Yeah, we're looking at this thing called PFAS." I'm like, "What now?" Because they use like the whatever the full acronym comes out to. I never remember. And I was like, okay, so what is that? And he said, it's literally in everything. You know those sales receipts you get from the store? I'm like, yeah. He's like, you know how they're shiny? Yeah. I said, PFAS. I said, oh. He said, the nonstick pans, PFAS. I'm like, okay. I thought these were good things. And he's like, no, it builds up in your body and it never goes away. I thought, does anyone care? I mean, I was literally being that naive about it. I'm like, does anyone really care about this stuff? And yes, they do.
And it's ubiquitous too. I mean, one of the reasons that industry has loved PFAS is because it doesn't break down easily. But if it doesn't break down easily on your nonstick pan or your raincoat, it also means that it doesn't break down in the environment.
Yeah. And a woman I was talking to said that the reason that you get plastic that can bend is because it has PFAS in it. And I didn't know that. Is one of the she said that's why plastic bends. If you can bend it, it's got PFAS in it. I didn't know that. Yeah. So it is quite literally in everything.
Yeah, they have found it in polar bear blood. They have found it at the top of Mount Everest. It is literally everywhere.
Good to know. So you're oh, I don't even know where you start with that on the litigation side of things or cleaning it. I mean, how do you even clean that up?
Well, it sounds like you know a little bit about it from one of your prior webcasts.
Yeah, I'm totally queuing that up with BioLargo does PFAS cleanup.
Love it. But that's one of the issues now. I mean, well, one of the issues is testing, because the regulatory standards, you know, we're used to dealing with parts per million and often parts per billion, but the regulatory standards for PFAS are parts per trillion. And number one, it's hard to find a lab with lab technology that can test down to those minuscule levels. And then even if they can, how to clean up to those levels is going to be a very big challenge.
And finding a lab, I believe they have to be a certified lab, right? It has to be recognized by the state, yeah.
Right.
Which those are few and far between when they're certified and licensed and regulated. So, so Brian, anything you want to tell people how they can find you or work with you? Let's say they have a PFAS issue. Let's say they have, you know, they want to buy some property and they're like, oh, now I'm scared to death. I don't know what to do. Can they give you a call and you can walk them through it?
Absolutely. Yeah. If you Google me, the first thing that'll come up is my Greenberg-Glusker web bio. You can give me a call. You can email me. It is, you know, I certainly handle litigation, but I also help with environmental due diligence. And so if someone gets a phase 1 report and they don't know which way is up in reading it, I help folks with that. If they know there's an issue and they think, well, does this issue kill the deal? Maybe not. You know, there are ways to negotiate a deal where maybe the seller retains liability. Maybe you can get environmental insurance. So there are ways to negotiate a deal, even if there are some environmental issues, so that it can go forward. And then certainly if none of that worked out and you get a letter from the water board or you find yourself having to clean up somebody else's mess, we certainly help with litigation on that as well.
Yeah, because you always want to be prepared, and you always want someone like Brian who knows the ins and outs, left and rights, ups and downs, because I used to write those reports. I used to be in that field quite frequently. If you're coming from the outside looking in, it's a different language. It's not going to make sense to you. You're not going to know what any of these regulatory requirements mean, parts per million, parts per billion, parts per trillion. It's going to be a mess. And save yourself the headache and just, you know, trying to Google all the answers. You're not going to be able to. Just hire these guys, find Brian online, because you'll save yourself such a headache and such a nightmare. And you're always probably going to miss something very important that you just didn't know about. And it's these guys' job to make sure that doesn't happen. So please, please, please look up Brian. He can help you with this stuff.
Thanks, Wendy. Yeah, I can't tell you the number of times I've seen a phase 1 that says there was a dry cleaner, but nothing to see here. Not so sure.
I've seen those reports. Oh, the contamination ended right at the property line. No, it didn't. So on that, Brian, thank you so much for your time. You're doing good work. You're a smart guy. We all know that. That's easily said. But you're helping people, which is what is most important on the environmental social justice side of things.
Thanks, Wendy. Thanks for having me back.
Anytime. So guys, I'm Wendy Nystrom, your host with Environmental Social Justice. Check out Brian. Check out his site. Do good things. We'll talk to you guys later. Bye.